Hello and welcome to From the Vaults, an ongoing series of essays that explore the history of Dungeons & Dragons in all its incarnations. The first essay series covered the official world settings released for D&D. This time, we're going to delve into the history of the video games developed for or inspired by D&D, as well as how this new platform impacted the game's popularity. We'll go decade by decade into the major games developed, starting with the 80s, a time in which both Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the mass production of computers and consoles into the mainstream market, happily coincided. Given the scope of video game development in the 80s, this first part will only cover up to 1984. The next installment will cover the rest of the decade. Before we even step into the 80s, however, there is one small but incredibly significant game that deserves recognition. Simply entitled D&D, and written in the Tudor language in Iowa in 1975, this simple game was one of the least known, yet greatest influences on all RPG games that would follow. One of the most notable features of D&D was a new concept in interactive video games where a single enemy, created to be a significantly higher challenge than previous foes, would attack the player's controlled character. This was the invention of bosses. The game D&D later inspired Dungeon of Death, released in 1979 by Instant Software in the PET language for TRS-80 home computers. With respects paid, let's get started with the official releases, and copycats, of D&D video games. The beginning of the decade was also the beginning of the home market for video games, and thus, very small. There was one game that came out in 1980, which helped transform the gaming landscape and popularize RPGs in general, known as Rogue. Rogue was a basic, straightforward game inspired by D&D and other fantasy works. Set from a top-down view, the player would move through a dungeon whose rooms were randomly connected together, making the dungeon different each time it was played, fighting monsters and collecting treasures. The simple game mechanics and layout were immediately copied by other programmers and gaming enthusiasts, with hundreds of Rogue clones being written in dozens of programming languages over the next 3 decades. Rogue's biggest contribution was its popularity. People who had never heard of fantasy games of roleplay, who also played video games, were during that era likely to discover Rogue and play it. The first licensed Dungeons & Dragons video game to be produced and sold was simply called Dungeons & Dragons Computer Fantasy Game by Mattel in 1981. Rather than being launched on a console, the game was a small, handheld electronic device. The rules of D&D had not yet been fully translated into programming language, and no official world setting was applied to the product. Despite this, the game was extremely popular, having been released in the fall and selling out 2 months before Christmas. Also in 1981, a small game was released in the Apple Pascal language by a new software company looking to make a name for themselves. The company was Sir Tech. The game was called Wizardry: Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This was the first installment of what became a long-running franchise which has been publishing new releases as recently as 2017. While not affiliated in any way with D&D, this game was inspired by other games written for the Plato system, the very same used by D&D back in 1975. The influence was immediately obvious, becoming more pronounced over the years with each new release. This independently developed game was the first of many to flood the market, introducing people globally to the RPG genre of video games alongside official products from the game that inspired them, D&D. Another contender for the newly forming RPG video game market that began in 1981 was Ultima, written for Apple II and eventually ported to Atari 8-bit, Commodore 64, and the IBM home computer. The Ultima series is known for making several contributions to the development of the basic framework for any modern RPG, the most significant being the very first game ever to be open world, a critical component for any modern MMORPG. 5 Ultima games were released in the 80s, the 4th and 5th of which are currently available at GOG.com in a bundle for $8 Canadian. Sales for the first few installments of the series were strong, generally received as favorable, but most importantly, quickly gaining a cult following of fans. 1982 was a big year for video games in general, as consumer demand was outpacing development. In response, a huge number of games for all genres were produced, which led to a very unfortunate event the following year. I'll get into that later. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons: Cloudy Mountain was released in 1982 by Mattel for the Intellivision. The game was the largest ever put together by the company, using over 4 kilobytes of ROM. Utilizing an open-world setting, introduced the year prior by the initial installment of the newly formed Ultima franchise, players had to form strategies for overcoming monsters in both melee and ranged combats, often having to travel through long, randomly generated mazes to eventually reach the game's final goal. AD&D Cloudy Mountain was in demand several years after its release, one of the first early games to demonstrate staying power in its popularity due to its creative design despite using almost none of the official rules for D&D in its design, something that would begin appearing in official game releases later in the decade. In the same year, TSR released another video game on the popular Apple II home computer platform entitled Dungeon. Alternating between overhead views for travel and second-person perspective for combat, Dungeon had static dungeons that were not randomized. Different character classes could be selected, though no customization of the character was provided, similarly to the way a player might choose a pre-existing character type in the popular Gauntlet game, released years later in 1985 in arcade form. Dungeon was closer to the actual experience of playing D&D, however, lacking the popular features of other existing games that provided direct competition, resulted in far less sales than AD&D Cloudy Mountain attained. Dungeons of Daga was also released in 1982, and while actual gameplay and story were lacking, the novel concept the game provided which fueled its popularity was the attempt to graphically render 3 dimensions in real time, an ambitious goal that was not achieved until the following decade. The graphics of this game were replicated for a number of well-known other RPGs developed later in the decade, including installments in the Wizardry franchise, as well as the Bard's Tale franchise. Both Wizardry and Ultima released the second installments of their franchises in 1982, receiving favorable reviews and growing their respective fan bases. Neither installment brought anything revolutionary to the RPG video game industry, however, both helped to expand player awareness of the genre, much like the creation of Rogue several years prior. This led into 1983, which is the beginning of the nightmarish video game crash that impacted the entire industry. With few regulations in place, dozens of consoles and hundreds of games were being churned out into the rabid marketplace. However, consumer interest was dropping. Video games were no longer in fashion, as costs, incompatibilities, and a lack of any kind of focus were alienating potential customers who, before the development of home consoles, were used to paying a mere quarter to enjoy a game in arcades, which, in the 70s, replaced the popular pinball games that had been in bars, malls, and malt shops since the 30s. Development of video games of any kind became much harder for the next several years, until the introduction of a new home console stabilized the market by creating a global interest that, in turn, also brought regulation to the free-for-all that had been in place up to that point. That console was the NES. Only one official game was released for D&D in 1983, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons: Treasure of Tarman, produced by Intellivision as a sequel to Cloudy Mountain. Most of the game was played in first-person perspective, utilizing the three-dimensional architecture introduced by Dungeons of Dagarath the year prior. The game was a worthy sequel. While not quite as popular in North America as its predecessor, it was very close, and in European markets, the game became an instant classic. RPGs were becoming more popular globally, and in 1983, another revolutionary game appeared in Japan. Boku Suka Wars was the first game to blend strategy and roleplay to create the tactical RPG genre. The player controlled an army composed of units modeled after chess pieces in a linear world, with the goal of defeating the enemy army without the player's character, who controlled the army, being defeated. Boku Suka Wars was eventually purchased by Nintendo and re-released in various forms on different platforms. In the same year, another tactical RPG was released in Japan, Nobunaga's Ambition, which also involved large-scale battles while also involving aspects of tending to the local economy, one of several inspirations for the Civilization franchise, which appeared in the following decade. As with the previous year, Wizardry and Ultima both released the third installment of their respective franchises in 1983. Wizardry had adopted more of the basic settings from the D&D franchise, though not affiliated with it. Alignment became an important part of the gameplay. The coding for Wizardry 3 also introduced the window manager to RPG game code, making graphical renders easier to manage and change for smoother and quicker transitions. Ultima 3 also brought its own new developments, allowing parties of characters to be established, something only Wizardry had managed prior, as well as allowing for the animation of characters, which had not yet been incorporated into the RPG genre. These new additions to the concept of RPG development expanded the genre further, and can be seen in their contemporary modern descendants. Another official D&D video game would not be released until 1987, in large part due not only to the video game crash, but also because of the power struggles going on inside TSR itself. The RPG genre continued to evolve from a series of games inspired by D&D, and 1984 saw the re-release of D&D in DOS form for home computers, as well as the start of the Black Onyx RPG series in Japan that popularized the genre in Asia. In the UK, the first official adaptation of a video game from a book in an RPG series was published. The series was Fighting Fantasy, created by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston, whom had met with Gygax to form the international arm of TSR, resulting in the Fiendfolio publication for D&D. And the game was based on the third book of that series, Forest of Doom. Fantasy video games were truly going global, despite the video game crash, and the continued development of the genre in the latter half of the decade brought its own delights and downfalls, which will be covered in the next part of this miniseries. Thank you for listening. I hope you found the information presented here interesting and helpful. If you played any of these games, or remember other standalone or franchises of the RPG genre developed during the time frame covered, please tell us all about them. Any comments and criticisms are appreciated.